Good morning, everybody. Bonjour. Let me start by saying that I'm really delighted to be here. This is a very interesting gathering of people, and I'm really glad that Cities Alliance put it together and enabled us all to come to actually share some very interesting ideas here today. I also want to say that I'm absolutely delighted to be on an all-female panel, and to say that we have given our moderator honorary female status today, so that we're all female. So thank you, Cities Alliance, for that one as well. The next thing I need to say is I have a message here that says, speak slow for the translators. That's not my strong point. So if the translators are struggling to keep up, will somebody please throw a shoe at me or something? Okay, how do I make my presentation move on? Next. Okay. Let me begin by saying that this project was done by the Pegasus Institute, but in association with Ethio Resources Group from Ethiopia. And we were looking at the whole issue of climate change and energy in Ethiopia, trying to conduct an investigation of viable alternative energy choices that can support inclusive growth within secondary cities, taking into account climate change and looking at issues of environmentally sustainable, low carbon and universally accessible energy sources. So trying to make sure that the solutions we came up with were accessible and included everybody within the cities and didn't leave out particularly the poor sectors of the city. It was a 6-month project, desktop research, literature review, and then interviews and workshops with people in Ethiopia, in Addis, and in our 2 secondary cities, Mekelle and Dirredawa. Next, please. So the objectives were interesting because part of the objectives were around research specifically and generating actionable research on energy choices for cities in Ethiopia in the light of climate change and growing energy demand. Aiming to empower cities in Ethiopia, but also other cities in Africa, with key information on how to make and potentially accelerate the transition to low-carbon development and how to meet their energy needs for development and socio-economic betterment. But doing that within a framework of looking at what the climate change impacts on Ethiopia's energy resources were. Then there was also an intention to strengthen the capacity of local and national research institutions and to support the emergence of a longer-term research agenda for relevant institutions. So in a sense, there were 2 streams to this project. One looking at the energy options in the face of climate change. The other looking at how one could actually strengthen the research community and the research requirements in Ethiopia. Very quickly, to set the context in terms of Ethiopia, it's a country in which there is a very high rate of urbanization off a relatively low base. It's not a highly urbanized country. There is a high fertility rate, which is contributing to the growth of cities, but there's also a very high economic growth rate. So things are really starting to move in Ethiopia. Secondary cities are particularly important. 75% of the urban population lives in secondary cities, and 60% of the manufacturing industry is based in secondary cities. A lot of that is around cement manufacturing. The energy picture is equally interesting because 91% of the energy is at the household level. The industrial use is 2% of energy use. 90% of the energy consumed in Ethiopia comes from biomass. And you can imagine the kind of implications that has. 8.5% from fossil fuels, 1.5% from electricity. According to government statistics, 60% of the urban areas can be defined as impoverished zones, which are described as being devoid of basic services. And 25% of urban dwellers live below the poverty line. But at the same time, 90% or more of urban households are actually connected to the grid. Of those, 96% of the households in secondary cities are using electricity for lighting. So that's the major use of electricity. 14% are using electricity for cooking. 75% of households use biomass, traditional biomass for cooking. We understand that there is in fact a shift towards electric cooking, but the actual statistics on what is happening on the trends are not available. The cost of power in Ethiopia is still relatively low. There are fairly large subsidies in place. And it's in fact the cost of the electrical appliances that seems to be the barrier to uptake of the use of electricity beyond lighting rather than the cost of power itself. But there is an expectation that the cost of power is in fact going to increase. If we look, next slide please. Okay, the next issue then was the issue of climate change in relation to energy provision in Ethiopia. Bearing in mind that hydropower forms a fairly substantial part of the generation of electricity. So what is climate change likely to do to Ethiopia? The one thing is certain, as with the rest of Africa, the temperatures are going to increase. And there are various implications of that, one of which is greater demand for cooling, but there are other implications around temperature increase. One of which is that evaporation increases, which may result in potentially lower flows in the dry season. Climate change is likely to result in greater variability and unpredictability of flows, greater climate extremes, which is likely to mean that the droughts will be more severe. The trends around rainfall are much more uncertain than the trends around temperature, and it seems as though there's going to be an increasing trend in rainfall. It's going to get wetter, but some of that will be offset by the increased temperatures and the increased evaporation. And then the issue of the drought periods remains a very significant challenge. What has not been done, as far as we're aware, is that there's been any kind of modeling of what climate change is going to do to energy demand, and it's an area where more work actually needs to be done. But what is on the cards is that it's likely that the impacts of the climate change are going to be similar to those in Uganda, and that the impacts on power will be similar, with similar impacts on the economy, looking possibly as a result of climate variability and climate change impacts, a loss of 3% on GDP. If you look at the table at the bottom, between 2006 and 2008, low levels in the dams, in the hydropower dams, meant that there were more than 6 months of power cuts. Scheduled blackouts started as once a week, but as the 6 months went on, customers lost power for 15 hours for 2 days a week. That, as you can imagine, has very substantial impacts on any ability for cities to act as engines of growth and of industrial growth in particular. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Shravya, who's going to take you through some of the findings from the project.